If you're not seeing steady drawing improvement for the work and the effort and the practice you're putting into it, it may not be for the reason you think. It may not be because you need to improve your technical skills, your line work ability, and so forth. The problem may be something that you really haven't thought is a problem. And because we haven't thought it's a problem, we haven't tried to improve the one thing that's actually going to vastly improve the results of our drawing. And that is how we observe our subject. Because what so many of us don't realize when we start to draw is that the sort of observation that we make in everyday life is actually not the same as the observation we need to do when we're drawing. Now, exactly how we need to draw does depend a bit on what we want to draw from our reference for our actual drawing. But if we're wanting to draw something that looks realistic, then the sort of everyday observation that we're used to actually won't be adequate to create the drawings that we're hoping to draw. Let me explain 7 ways I consciously think, when I observe my reference, to make sure that I observe all the information I need to see in my reference, not for everyday life, but to create the drawing I want to draw. I need to look for things that I would never think about looking for ordinarily in life, but which will be essential if my drawing is going to capture all I want it to capture from the reference. Can I say the very last point is a new way of seeing something, of saying something, of explaining my process. So make sure you don't miss the last point. One of the first things I always look to observe carefully when I started drawing, before I start the drawing, are the depths of plane. If I were to create a series of, if you like, silhouetted shapes on cards, 3 or 4 cards deep, what would be on each set of cards? What would be on the front card? What are my foreground issues going to be that are going to be closer? Maybe in my midground, I'm going to divide that into 2 depths of plane. What's going to be on the front mid and what's going to be on the back mid, and what things are going to be in the far distance plane. It's so important that I get this very clear in my head, because how I draw, the marks I use to create a realistic effect of these depths of plane, mean that I have to know, if you like, which plane it sits in before I make any marks to do with that object. It's not just getting the shape right, getting it accurate, but it's getting a sense of just how much detail really can we see at this distance, and how much should I simplify the detail to help it look further back? How much should I lessen the value of the shadows to help it feel further back? How much of a lighter line do I need to use to really help convey the effect of the distance in this far distant depth? And of course, all the opposite things I need to think about for the closest objects, but making sure I don't bring them too far forward if it's actually what's happening in, say, the front midground, which is the star event of the scene. This is particularly important to do with a photo, because photos, by the very mechanism of how the camera works, flattens everything we see. If you like, all the depths of plane are concertinaed into one plane. The effects we get in life, we have to read back into our subject, read back into our photo, so then we can draw those and actually capture a more realistic sense of depth than the average photographic process gives us. The second thing I need to do when I'm observing is not just observing the shapes and the outlines, but observing the values. How dark are the darks compared to the light of the lights? How many darks are there? How many lights are there? How much mid-value is there? And if I change this presumably colour photo to black and white, does a lot of it become less clear because all the mid-values, while they look very distinct in colour, in a monochromatic presentation, it's a bit hard to see where one object finishes and another one begins. So I need to, if you like, go beyond what I see and create darker values in some places so as to create more clarity in my drawing. And this isn't something I can do just once in each spot as I work around. I need to be continually observing the entire scene because we understand values in relation to the values around them. Whether a value looks light or dark is not dependent on just looking at that value, but it's the values that are next to it. If there are other dark values around it, it's not going to look as dark as if there's a very light value next to it. So my observation is not just look at a little part and draw it, look at another little part and draw it. As I create my whole scene, as I start to bring it out, I'm continually re-observing what's in the reference and then re-observing the effect I've created and starting to adjust and manipulate certain parts that overall will create the effect I want. This third way that I observe in every drawing I do, in terms of my reference and what I'm drawing, is that I'm not just observing the shapes, I'm not just looking at the height to width ratio of a window, say, that I'm going to put into a wall, but I'm also looking at the space, if you like, the shape between the windows, as if it were an object I was drawing rather than simply the gap between two objects. Because in life, the sort of observation we do for everyday life, when we have things such as a wall of windows, our eyes are drawn to the windows. And afterwards, we may be able to describe the window quite well, but we may not be able to describe the gap between the windows as well, because our brain switches off with that bit. It saves a bit of memory and processing space, recognizing that the space between, visually and probably in a practical sense, isn't very important at this point. So it can save energy for processing how you'll, run away from the bear that's running up behind you. So when I observe for drawing, I need to see the spaces around objects as objects themselves that I want to create, that I want to draw in my drawing by the way I place the objects. Another reason why we need to learn to observe our reference in a deeper, fuller way, a way that's actually tailored for the information that we need to collect for our drawing, is because, well, as the phrase goes, familiarity breeds contempt. We tend to take for granted what we see over and over again. And one of the things we take for granted is that we've seen something in its entirety, that we've seen how it is in the particular reference that we're looking at, in these conditions, with this lighting, at this angle, made of this material, at this distance, all the things that can change the way an object looks. We think we've seen enough, and then we go to draw what we think we've seen. And most of the time, the difference between how my drawing looks in terms of accuracy of shape and what's in the reference is the degree to which I've thought I've seen enough when I haven't. Because when I simply haven't spent enough seconds looking at the object in the reference, when I go to draw, I'm actually now connecting with my memories, with my past experience of this object. And now I'm not just seeing what I've taken in from the reference, but I've started to mix it with memories I've got, past experiences, perhaps past drawings I've done even. In effect, I'm drawing as much from my imagination, sometimes from the look of some drawings I've seen, even more than I am drawing from actually what my reference looks like. A big kookaburra just swooped down low, right behind the camera. This is him on a branch up above me, where he was for a bit. If you listen in the last point, you'll hear him do his familiar kookaburra laugh. And that's why so often our drawings of common objects so often end up looking generic. Say our trees all look the same regardless of the type of tree. All of our houses even sort of look the same. That comes because we haven't actually seen the particular detail that we need to see to capture the distinctiveness of this particular object in these conditions. Another way I've had to learn to observe when I'm drawing is to not just focus on the height and the width, the proportions of the parts of the building that I'm drawing, and not just observing the gaps, if you like, the spaces between, but it's also working hard to always be looking for the alignment points. And by the alignment points, I mean, firstly, in my reference, what parts of the architecture line up with each other, or where do things line up with each other? So for instance, I may have a pitched gable front where the roof comes to a point. But how do I know exactly where to put that point? Well, I look on my reference first, and if I draw a straight line from that top of that point down into the front wall of the building, what does it line up with? If it lines up with, say, the center or the side of the third window from the left, then I find the third window from the left on my drawing, and I align it with that, with a dot on the paper first, because it may be that if my drawing's a little inaccurate, I may need to have to shift slightly where it's at, but it gives me the best starting point to work out where to put that gable so that my overall proportions stay in place. It's not just on the vertical, it's on the horizontal as well. If I have a large, say, window on the front wall, on a side wall, I might have a small window. Well, I align where does the top of this smaller window line up with the larger window on the front in the reference. Now I find that point on my paper. So everything I go to draw, I'm usually looking for at least 2 alignment points, a vertical and a horizontal one. Sometimes there's only one because we haven't drawn enough of the drawing yet to give us whichever one we're missing. But this is why the tempo of a drawing picks up in the second half, because we end up, the more we've drawn, having more reference points, which means working out accurately where new things need to be positioned becomes easier because we have more points to reference them with. This next point is, in a way, flipping our observation onto the other side, because it's not the observation we make with our reference, but it's putting that same level of observation onto our drawing, or as much as we have drawn. And that as we progress the drawing, with every new lot of marks or lines or dots or whatever we put on the paper for either placement or to start to create the effect of the subject that we want, that we actually stop and we look at our drawing. We compare what we've done then by observing the reference again, and then by bringing that observation of the reference back to what we've done, particularly if we've just placed a few positional marks. Sometimes where we think the marks are going to go can feel different just with the blank paper, but when we actually say put a dot where we think that line might be, where we think that wall might end in relation to the window perhaps that we've drawn, now it's clear to us that there's actually some ink on the paper, that dot where we were going to position the end of the wall is just too close or too far from the window, and we can make the adjustment. And we can trust it at the end of the drawing. If that dot's not covered by something else, if it's hanging out in space, so to speak, it's going to be such a minute mark that it's not really going to draw any attention. It's not going to compete with the overall finished drawing. So it's learning to observe what I've drawn while there's still time to make adjustments. I observed the reference once, I observed the reference twice, I put a positioning mark on the paper. I now imagine the finished line or effects drawn there, whatever. I look back at my reference and now I double check that mark to make sure it still feels like it's in the right place, or maybe now, having looked at the reference again, having drawn the mark, I realize the mark needs to be bumped a little bit in one direction or another. So I do that, and now when I go to actually, if you like, firm in whatever I'm drawing, however I'm drawing it, I'm able to do it more accurately. So this point is the way I'm thinking, the steps, the processes I'm thinking, the filter, the lens, if you like, I'm using when I look at an object. Firstly, I look at it as a two-dimensional shape. So when we're thinking shape, we're simply thinking 2 dimensions, height and width. Now a shape is something we could draw on a sheet of paper and take it and stick it on another sheet of paper. A sphere may be a 3-dimensional form, but if we draw a sphere, we end up with a circle. If we cut the circle out, we have a 2-dimensional representation, if you like, of that 3-dimensional object. But the starting point is seeing it as it is, because that shape will reflect the position, the angle, the perspective of where we're looking at it from, how far away it is, the lighting, and so forth. So I need to pay attention firstly to that shape, because I want the shape of what I draw to be the same. But more than that now, I need to look past the flattening out of the photographic process, and I need to see the form. I need to imagine how this would look in real life, where the things behind it feel a bit blurry because my eyes are focusing in front of them on this object. And I'm getting a sense of the roundness of it, or whatever shape it might be, whichever way planes, whether they come towards us or away from us, may go. I focus on the three-dimensionality of it because I'm going to want to capture that three-dimensionality in my drawing. And then thirdly, now that I'm thinking of form, I'm thinking of roundness, of closeness, of further back. Now, when I observe what I'm looking at, I'm thinking about what's the visual effect, the overall visual effect in this scene, and then the overall visual effect I'm wanting in my drawing. So I may want something to be less prominent in my drawing than how it looks in the photo, because the photo has flattened things, but I want to create a sense of depth, so I'm going to draw it in a way that it will feel a lot further back. So I won't draw everything I see, and the way I, if you like, put marks on the paper for those objects that far back will be different marks and a different way I put them on the paper for the things that I want to feel really close to us. This observation is also so that I can start to process what marks will create the effect for things where I can't draw all the detail. If I have a tree in the background, how many leaves are there? Am I going to draw every leaf or not? And if I'm not, then what's the overall effect when I look at this particular tree under these conditions? What parts of it am I going to want to perhaps draw in a little bit of detail? Maybe these leaves here, maybe those leaves there, but then which leaves am I going to want to just create marks and use value that will create the effect for our brain to understand as the rest of the leaves without having to draw the rest of the leaves. We may think of drawing the effect of detail as a technique to use, and it is, but we can only use it if we've firstly applied it to our observation. We need to be observing to see the effect of each part of our drawing reference, particularly if that part is not the closest and or main thing in our drawing. When we have a focus in life, we have a focal point, usually directly in front of us in the center, and then as we move towards the periphery of our vision, we don't see as much detail. We more sense it's there often than see it. Now, this doesn't happen with a photo of the same scene because the photo is so much smaller than life. And therefore, I can see the whole thing pretty much with an equal focus all at once. But if I want to create a sense of reality as if I'm standing in that place looking at this scene rather than copying a photo, then I want to restore some of that sense of there's a focal point and then there's periphery, and I need to control and change my marks to convey the difference for the visual effect that that periphery gives to this scene in life. In effect, I need to observe my reference carefully enough that I can translate how I'm going to change this reality, especially if there's a lot of details, think of grass on the ground, into marks on the paper, because that's what I'm doing. I'm doing translation work. And when we translate, we need to study and to understand the language we're translating from just as much, if not more, than the language we're translating into. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. If you feel that your drawing development, improvement hasn't perhaps been the pace that you would have liked, that you thought you might have had by now, then I really hope these points can put you in a direction where there might be some really significant answers for you that will really start to change to inform your observation of references when you draw, and therefore give you everything you need to make the best use of all the drawing technique skills that you've developed. But hey, remember that in the end, however we draw, however we observe, however our drawings end up looking like, we need to make sure we have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.